last summer that I saw Grandpa, I spent several weeks at his cabin. Grandpa refused to leave his property and his log cabin in the woods near Epworth, Georgia, so we made regular trips up to check on him and help him out. Grandpa was born and raised in the area, working at the copper mines in Fannin County as a young man. When he returned from the war and married Grandpa, he wanted to have a quiet place to call home. Dad and my uncles were raised in his cabin, and I used to spend a lot of time there with Grandma and Grandpa. Grandma passed away when I was 10. I think I miss her funny explanations for Grandpa's quirks the most. Grandpa was a little odd and often said eccentric things. When a crow would caw, he would yell that he wasn't accepting messages. He named every billy goat that was born King Puck, and when I was grumpy as a kid, he would ask if I was a changeling and where they'd put the real me. He would also remind my cousins and me to avoid the very back of the property, where the rock mound was. He told us it was a native burial mound and that the fairies guard it with the help of the pukas. Their magical fairy crosses were around the burial mound to keep humans away. Once we were older, we stopped believing in kidnapping pukas, but his warnings did keep us away from the burial mound, especially his warning about the stone men that visited it. He loved telling us stories about the stone men, but it always came with the admonition to keep our distance. He described them as hulking beasts that walked on two legs with a dense covering of gray or black hair, bulging shoulders that looked like there were two rocks under their coat, and a head that looked like a boulder resting on top. The first stone men he had said that he had seen crouched down behind the burial mound. At the time, its shoulders and head looked to be part of the mound. He had heard of the stone men in local folklore, and the name stuck in his mind, even long after people started calling them Bigfoot. He spoke of them with reverence, lecturing us about respecting all the creatures of the forest. I arrived at Grandpa's the day before what would have been his and Grandma's anniversary. When I pulled up, it was easy to find him, leaning against the garden fence, taking a rest. The summer heat brought out his neck sweat ring on his shirt, but he looked comfortable outside. I hurried to say our hellos, and he gave me an update on his health, ox-like of course, and the garden was well on its way to producing a nice crop. He guaranteed me plenty of back-breaking work, only half joking. Lately there had been an increase of hunters seen along the fence line, and a few had trespassed. Grandpa took pleasure in watching the wildlife enjoy his property, so he never hunted on his own land. It annoyed him when people tried to hunt on his little sanctuary. While catching up with Grandpa, we walked over to the garden, and he was proud to point out his watermelons. They were larger than last year's, and the look on his face conveyed his pride in these particular melons. He explained that this variety was similar to one he ate as a child, sugary sweet with a softer rind for pickling. They were his special project, something to keep his 80-year-old mind and body active. As he was extolling the virtues of his watermelons, I saw some movement near the tree line on the far end of the garden. There were two men on our side of the fence. I mentioned it to Grandpa, and he said he saw rifles. He started to stride fast towards the hunters, me right on his heels. Grandpa neared the two hunters and yelled, "You lost? This is private property on this side of the fence." The two men climbed back over the post and rail fence, back to the forest side, and told Grandpa that they were lost. I didn't buy it. They had to climb over a fence, and fences mean boundaries. I yelled at the men, telling them to leave before I called the sheriff. Their response sent me over the edge, telling me that I was crazy and they weren't hunting. Grandpa patted my shoulder and told me to calm down as they turned and went back into the woods. Grandpa tossed a pair of gloves to me, and we started weeding the garden. I answered his questions about my college adventures to pass the time. He never had a desire to go to college. He was a hands-on person, but he still loved hearing the stories from his sons and grandkids. The sun was sinking below the trees, casting shadows into the back end of the garden, and making the forest beyond the fence look impenetrable. I heard the loud snap of a branch come from the forest. I asked Grandpa about the noise, and he brushed it off, saying that bears don't like eating floral-scented college folk. I looked back down at the ground, finding weeds among the lettuce rows near the front of the garden, until I saw movement by the fence line. I lifted my head again, and I could see a large, dark shape hop over the fence. Grandpa wasn't kidding about the persistence of the hunters out here. I stood up and yelled at the figure, "Hey, I thought I told you to leave!" I started walking towards the figure as it hunched over and grabbed one of the massive watermelons. As it stood up, I yelled again, letting the figure know that I was calling the sheriff. I took several steps towards the figure until I noticed it looked like an animal. A massive bear maybe, but more manlike. I stopped and started stepping back, unsure of what I was seeing. It hopped back over the fence and disappeared into the dark forest just as Grandpa joined me. He asked me if I was okay, and I told him that I had just seen a bear on 2 legs steal his watermelon, still miffed by what I had witnessed. Grandpa chuckled a little, saying it wasn't a bear. They were his neighbors, and the watermelons were for them. He went on, saying it has been a while since they've come over, but they've been visiting since he first moved here. He said that that was one of the stone men he had talked about. He explained that he had been observing them and believed that they were indigenous people, just hairy and tall. He had heard them talk, and it sounded like some of the native languages that he had heard on TV documentaries. I couldn't believe what Grandpa was saying. This creature looked like the Bigfoots people were searching for, but here Grandpa was saying that they lived nearby and had a language. He went on, saying that the one I saw was probably the husband. Grandpa reckoned he was not much older than myself. He had watched him grow up, seeing this individual for the first time when I was a little girl. Bears and coyotes used to kill Grandpa's chickens, but that stopped when this little fella, as he called it, started coming into the watermelon patch. As appreciation and a show of kindness, he made sure to plant watermelons for the unique neighbors. The sun set as we started for the graveyard to say goodnight to Grandma, and I continued to pick Grandpa's brains about his neighbors. After spending a lifetime hearing his tales and dismissing them as fanciful, my mind was having a hard time adjusting to this new information. The way Grandpa talked, he seemed to have been studying his neighbors for a long time. They lived in the woods beyond his property. They left arrowheads on top of the fence posts sometimes. He thought that they didn't like the sound of gunshots, and perhaps they felt safe stepping out of the woods here. The way Grandpa kept referring to his neighbors implied he thought of them as humans. Yes, a human can be hairy. Yes, a human can be tall. But this neighbor of his was beyond what was normal for a human. Maybe he was right, though. He knew more about them than I did. We reached Grandma's gravestone. Wet leaves sat atop the stone with arrowheads next to them. Grandpa picked up the arrowheads and gave them to me. I have a box of these now. I have no clue how they find so many. I gestured to the leaves. What are those? A sly smile crossed his face. Open one. I reached out and picked one up. It was moist and heavy. I pulled open the leaf and squealed. It was a dead mouse. What human would think a dead mouse was a gift? Grandpa gathered up the rest of the leaf packets and the arrowheads before patting Grandma's headstone. I don't want to be rude, he said. Grandpa turned towards the cabin, and the thought crossed my mind that he may be losing his. Originally, I was only going to stay a week at the cabin with Grandpa, but considering that he seemed to be losing his mental faculties, I stayed a few extra weeks to observe him. College was out for the summer, and I didn't have a summer job. Plus, I didn't want to let Dad know that I thought Grandpa may have dementia. Grandpa loved his home, and unless he was a danger to himself, I didn't want the family to take him away from his happy place. As the weeks rolled by, I discovered why Grandpa was so fit. This man spent every day working on the property and in the garden. The 1 week of hard work for us visitors was just an ordinary week for him. I didn't see the stone man while working in the garden, but I swear I could see dark shadows moving near the fence at sunset. It became clear to me that overall, Grandpa's mind was fine. I was, however, starting to question my own mind. It also became clear that Grandpa wasn't joking about the hunters coming by. I'm sure I had gained a reputation in the hunting community. Maybe Hillbilly Hellwoman was a fitting nickname. Every hunter that came near the property line received a good yelling and threats about trespassing. I made sure to give them all hell, hoping they would stay away and leave Grandpa alone. It seemed to be working. Each time it seemed to be different hunters. I decided that I would go home after helping Grandpa one last time at the farmer's market. It was a small town market where your truck bed was your table. He never made much money, but he loved talking to the locals and socializing. We woke up early to harvest some of his vegetables and loaded them into his pickup truck. Grandpa directed me to pick the smaller melons and leave the big ones, giving me a knowing wink. We took the wheelbarrow to gather the watermelons and worked together, gently setting them into the back of the truck. Grandpa did his final checks, secured his garden goods, then we climbed up into the truck. He took another look out of his rear window, and his face turned bright red. He mumbled something about hunters, stumbled back out of the truck, and started screaming. I saw two men climbing the fence looking towards a young buck near the cemetery, their shotguns off their shoulders. Grandpa stopped screaming and fell to the ground. I clambered across the bench seat in the truck and stumbled out the door, running to Grandpa. He was laying on the ground, clutching his chest, his face still red, taking short, gasping breaths. He still had a pulse, though. Heart attack. Thinking quickly, I helped him get into the truck because any ambulance would have to take a long trip up to the cabin. I started the truck and dialed 911 as I began driving down the mountain as fast as I could, coordinating to meet with the ambulance. I reached the intersection before the ambulance, and I could hear the sirens in the distance as I held Grandpa's hand, waiting for them to reach us. His face was eerily pale, and it felt as though he were withering away. I kissed his cheek, crying, and he gave my hand one last squeeze before letting go as the EMTs opened the passenger door. They began attending to Grandpa and let me know what hospital to meet them at. As the ambulance sped away, I called Dad and he took over contacting people while I drove to the hospital. The doctor said I did everything right, but I still couldn't shake the feeling that I should have done more. He told me that what happened at the cabin was the first signs of a heart attack. It wasn't until Grandpa's second day in the hospital that the massive heart attack occurred and he passed away swiftly. I tried comforting myself by finding peace in the small blessings. He didn't pass away alone at home, and he was able to see his friends and family one last time. Among all the positivity coming from the family, Grandpa had insisted on planning his own funeral. He said that he knew the end was coming, and he wanted to be sure he was put next to Grandma. After Grandpa passed away, burial plans were made swiftly. Grandpa wanted to be buried just as his ancestors had been. No embalming or fancy coffin, no screaming or crying. Just a simple shroud, his box of arrowheads with him, a hole in the ground, a headstone, and a wake in the cabin for family and friends. Grandpa had joked, to the family's horror, about having a traditional wake with him stinking up the cabin in the warm weather. Dad decided Grandpa would need to accept a fast burial with a simple box because of the lack of embalming and the heat wave in the area. The wake would have made Grandpa proud. The only screaming was the riotous laughter, and the tears were accompanied by smiles. He had lived a life with the curiosity of a cat, and if the stories were to be believed, he far exceeded his 9 lives. After the wake, I offered to stay and watch over the cabin until the fall session in college started. In about a week, the family planned to get together to sort through Grandpa's belongings and decide what to do with his property. After that, I still had another 3 weeks to take care of the property. I wanted to say my goodbyes to this place that was such an important piece of my childhood. Even if they decided to keep the property, it would never be the same without Grandpa. He loved and cared for this little slice of heaven on earth in a way that only he could. That first week of staying alone on the property was filled with tearful weeding and screaming outrage at any hunters that came by. I knew they weren't likely to be the same hunters, but the loss of Grandpa was still so raw that I blamed all hunters for his heart attack. It felt good to yell at someone, but I slowly grew numb to the feeling. Every night I would go and visit Grandma and Grandpa's graves to say goodnight. I would sit on the ground between their graves and talk about the day, releasing any pent-up emotions, crying aloud. I always felt like the fog lifted from my mind while visiting their graves, as if their spirits had erased anything negative. When the family gathered to settle all the final details, it was clear that Grandpa had been planning on making everything easy for us. Some of his plans seemed a bit odd to the rest of the family, but it was clear to me that he was trying to protect the wildlife and his neighbors. He requested that if we sold the property, to try and get another person who enjoyed growing their own food and wildlife. Grandpa had also parceled the back of the property with an easement to the road so the family would retain ownership of the cemetery and the burial mound area. There was enough area to have small gatherings, which he said he hoped we would do, while still being easy enough to maintain between the remaining family members. It felt better knowing this wouldn't be a permanent goodbye. On my last day on the property, I mowed the grass areas, collected some vegetables from the garden to take back to school with me, then started back to the cemetery to say goodbye to Grandma and Grandpa. As I neared the back of the property, I could hear a moaning sound. It sounded low, yet loud, and very human. Chills ran down my spine because nobody was supposed to be on the property but myself. I didn't know what I would encounter, but I stepped towards the tree line and hid behind a tree as I tried to identify the source of the sound. It sounded as though it were coming from the cemetery. I looked around the tree and found the source of the moaning. Standing over Grandpa's grave were 4 hairy figures. Their backs were towards me, but I could see the definition of their muscles under the dark hair glistening in the fading sunlight. One was clearly the largest. Grandpa's little fella came to my mind. The second largest was still massive, but noticeably smaller than the first. There were 2 small ones with the 2 adults. Between them, sitting on Grandpa's grave, was a huge watermelon. I stayed still, barely breathing, observing Grandpa's neighbors. I needed to know that I really saw what I had seen with Grandpa. I could see why Grandpa thought they were a native tribe. So much about them was human-like, but the way their head and shoulder area fit together seemed more like a gorilla. Their arms seemed to be the wrong proportion for a human as well. The largest one knelt down and started dragging his finger through the newly sprouted grass, tearing it up a little. For a moment I was concerned they would try to dig Grandpa up. But the large one stopped, and I heard a weird sound, somewhat like a pss, pss sound. The other 3 knelt down and copied the large one. I wasn't sure what they were doing, but I did know they were mourning in their own way. Tears came to my eyes as I watched them. I wanted to say goodbye to Grandpa and Grandma, but I had had weeks to visit their graves. They needed their time now. I quietly tiptoed away, crying as the moaning started again. I did a final check on the house before getting into Grandpa's truck and driving away. Between the start of fall semester and when summer break started, Grandpa's property was maintained by his local friends and their family. It was a very wet spring, which slowed the sale of the property. In mid-June, the property finally went under contract, and as soon as school was out, I drove back to visit the entire property one last time. After this, I would only be able to visit the cemetery. As I pulled into the driveway and got out of the truck, tears welled up in my eyes. The garden was barren, but the rows still remained. Grandpa's friends must have been stripping the garden to keep the vines from overrunning the property. They didn't know Grandpa was feeding his neighbors. I turned away from the sad garden and walked over to the cemetery. From a distance, I could see a lush green ground cover. As I reached the fence surrounding the cemetery, I realized they were watermelons. They were far bigger than the ones that were in the garden, and the vines all traced back to Grandpa's grave.